Good day to you. I like to drink beer. Do you like to drink beer? Not in the morning, of course, like it is right now, about 10 o'clock. But I like to drink beer, and one of the most fascinating things is to drink beer in different countries. Because you can go to France, for example, and it can be really hot and sunny, and you can ask for a beer, and they'll bring you a beer in a glass like this. It may not show it on the camera here, but this is kind of a tiny glass. This is 10 ounces. And you'll get this glass, and you'll be thirsty as an American, and you'll want to drink it down, but you'll notice French people sitting next to you are taking an hour to sip on their beer. In the meantime, you can go to a place like England, and when they bring you a beer, it's in a glass like this, 16 ounces. And when they're handing you the beer is pouring out of the top of the glass, and it's falling all over the bar on top of towels, as if no square centimeter of space should be wasted inside the glass. It should be full with beer. It's an example of how you can be led to a perception that the French may be cheap or chintzy, or they may not appreciate beer as much as Americans, whereas the English maybe appreciate beer more than Americans and drink more of it and are rather gluttonous with beer. It's all about perception, and that's what this chapter is all about. It's about perception and intercultural communication competence. I want to remind you that as I go through these instructor video lectures, that I'm not covering everything in the chapter. I can't in a video. My videos have to be shorter than the classroom because you lose interest. And so I want to remind you that when you read those chapters, to make sure that you're going through all of them, even the boxes that have examples and case studies, because all of that material is game for the quiz. So let's dig into today's material. We're talking about perception, and perception is really a prerequisite to communication. You have to perceive things before you are able to communicate. Otherwise, you don't have anything to communicate about, and you don't have any sense of direction in what you're going to communicate about. So perception is a prerequisite. And it all starts with sensing. Sensing is something that we're going to be talking about a little bit later in the class, but sensing is essentially taking in stimuli from your surroundings through your five senses. You know, your smell, your taste, your hearing, and the other two senses as well. So you have things going on all around you all the time, and it's what you're taking in and how you process that that develops your communication and your understanding of intercultural communication. So let's move on to the idea of effects of culture on sensing, because that's really what we're studying in this class is culture, and we're going to talk about how it affects sensing things. And we know that there are some general differences between the East and the West. We're going to be talking about that throughout the course, but in the West, which we would consider to be Western Europe and the United States and all of North America, there's a kind of a different outlook to life than you find in the East, which is moving from from Eastern Europe on through the Middle East and on to the Far East, which would be China and even Australia. And one of those differences is that people who are raised in Western cultures tend to see things from an individual standpoint. We tend to promote individualism in our culture. So a quick example is when I ask my class, what is it that you want to achieve in life? To start out any class that I'm teaching, a lot of people say, well, I want to be successful, or I want to make a lot of money, some people say, or I want to travel, or I want to be happy. Notice the key to those four sentences is they are all beginning with I. We are from a very individual culture where we're taught to promote ourselves, to seek out things individually. When I ask that same question to a class that might include somebody from Japan or China or Vietnam, a lot of times when it comes to them, they'll say something like, I hope we all get a great learning experience in this class. I hope we all get to know each other. I hope that we all achieve a sense of belonging. These are the kinds of things they say, which are very typical of Eastern cultures. They are collective cultures. They are cultures based more on communal harmony than they are on individual achievement. So that's one thing about culture in the grand sense of the term, where whether you're from a Western country or an Eastern country, that could affect the way that you see culture. There was a researcher, his name was Seagull, like the spelling of the bird except with two L's, and he found that people moving away from the East-West divide, when you're looking at people growing up in agrarian cultures that have a lot of nature around them, like you see around me, trees, for example, that those people tend to have a greater perception of jagged lines, slanted lines, and angles than people who grow up in cities. People who grow up in cities are not as sensitive to lines being out of kilter. So, for example, if you go into a bathroom in a big city and you see that there's a flyer posted for a band that's playing in a nightclub, that flyer might be slightly crooked like that. Nobody really cares because the information is there and you can read what time it is and where the location is. But a person who has grown up in the farm area and who goes into the bathroom and sees that flyer, they may be bothered by it because it's not exactly square. They are more sensitive to the lines because you have so many lines around you in your surroundings. It's an interesting study. You can decide if you want about that. Now let's go on to perceiving. And when we're talking about the process of perception, which is what perceiving is, we're talking about 3 stages that are said to be taking place every time you're perceiving something, which then builds into how you communicate interculturally. Those 3 stages are selection, organization, and interpretation. So let's take all 3 of them. The first one is selection. Selection is the idea that you have stimuli going on around you all the time. And it's not necessarily the case that you are focusing on all the stimuli. For example, there's a bird in the distance right now. Let's see if it will call when I'm hoping it will. Okay, there it is. So, did you hear that bird before I pointed it out? That's what selection is about, that there are things that you're seeing or possibly seeing, there are things that you're possibly hearing that you may not be paying attention to until you listen. I don't know if you're able to hear the traffic noise, but there's Route 80 that's not too far from here, and that's sort of murmuring in the background until you say, hey, I can hear that noise now. I'm focusing on it. I'm listening to it. I'm processing it. Now, we find that selection comes to play in languages and the subtlety of languages. For example, the book talks about how vowels in the United States, A, E, I, O, U, they are not as important in language as vowels are in other countries. And you can see plenty of examples in the book from Japan. You can see how just the addition of one extra A in a word, so that you have 2 A's, changes the entire meaning of the word, which means you draw out the vowel. Whereas in the United States, we can say Alabama, as the book gives an example, or we can say Alabama, as a Southern person might say. And that really doesn't make much difference to the meaning of the word. So this is an example of how in American culture, the vowel is something that we don't pay that much attention to selecting when we listen to it because it doesn't necessarily impact the meaning. And there's a term that's used to describe this idea of selecting further, and that term is called field dependence. Field dependence. Field dependence is the degree to which perception of an object is influenced by the background environment. It's the degree to which the perception of an object is influenced by the background of the environment. Just take, for example, when you go to cross the road. If it's a very, very, very busy road, you're looking at the overall traffic pattern so that you don't get in a bad situation where something's coming at you from the left or the right or straight on or from behind you. So you're kind of looking at the big picture. And so when you see a bus that's coming down the road, you may be less likely to see that bus in particular because you're looking at the truck, you're looking at the taxi, you're looking at the bicycle, you're looking at the pedestrian, you're listening to the engine behind you, you're looking at the big picture there. Whereas if you're crossing a country road and a yellow bus comes down to pick up kids for school, you're really aware of that yellow bus because the background is not as full of information. So field dependence is an important concept in terms of what's going on in the background when you're trying to interpret culture. Anyway, that wraps up the first stage of perception, and that is selection. Now let's go on to the second stage, which is organization. Once you decide to focus on a bird call, or you decide to focus on a person's vowel, the next step in trying to come up with the way of processing that is to organize that perception into categories. And as human beings, we tend to organize things into like-minded categories. We put things that seem alike together. For example, if you have very little experience traveling to Europe, one thing that you still may be aware of is that nudity is treated very differently on television and in film and even on radio in Europe. This is one of the areas of my expertise that I published a lot of my articles on, is nudity and violence and drugs and alcohol and other areas of content which differ across the world. And so you may say to yourself, you know, well, over in Europe, nudity is more natural, so they'll allow it on television. But in actual fact, there are differences. There are big differences. In Sweden, for example, a country that I'm taking my class to in July, a class that I'm teaching called Comparative Media, nudity is so openly presented in Sweden that you can go to the beach and people will take off their bathing suits and put on their clothes when they're done swimming right on the beach and go home. Or you can go to visit a person who has a sauna on their property, and it's expected that everybody goes down and gets in the sauna and takes off their clothes and then jumps in the lake to open up their pores to get rid of the toxins and then back into the sauna. It's a very natural view. But you're not going to find that behavior in France, even though in France you will find naked females in commercials for bathroom hygiene products like deodorant. They will actually show a topless female. And that's not the same as being naked in society like Sweden has. So we're grouping those things together, and we're just saying that Europe in general has a more permissive attitude with nudity, but really there are differences that are going on. And so my main point here is we tend to organize things by putting them together, but sometimes we're not able to distinguish that there still are big differences between those things that we're putting together. Another example is some people in the United States, particularly in discussing the most recent election campaign, they will take the concept of immigrants, and that is a like-minded category, and into that category they'll put Mexicans, they'll put Ecuadorians, they'll put Hondurans, they'll put Puerto Ricans, and really there are lots of differences there. I mean, one view of Mexicans, for example, is that the United States, approximately a third of it, actually is made up of former Mexico. Yeah, all the states like Texas, Utah, even Wyoming, California certainly, New Mexico, Arizona, that was all part of Mexico before the United States took it. So to look at those people who are living in the south of those areas and even people on the other side of the border as being immigrants, it's a different view when you consider the history of how some Mexicans have been incorporated into our culture. At any rate, that wraps up organization, the second step. Now let's go to the third and final step of perception, and that is interpretation. And interpretation is where you attach meaning to the sensory data that you're receiving. You attach meaning to it. And we attach meaning based on culture. One of the starkest examples that I can give to this is if you were raised by parents who are kind of typical in America, at some point you've had Gerber baby food. The Gerber brand is very big. And on the Gerber baby food bottle, you have the baby's head, the cute baby's head with the curly queue of hair and the dimpled chin. And that's designed to have you feel that you're presenting food to your baby and the baby's so cute and is going to stay healthy. But when Gerber baby food was imported to Africa, Africa is a very literal society when it comes to food. Most of Africa, I shouldn't lump all of Africa together. And the baby's head indicated to Africans that what was inside of the jar? A baby's head. So Gerber baby food did not sell very well in Africa, in part because the interpretation was based on culture. So interpretation is very individual, and just that idea of food in general is a very interesting idea to discuss. I mean, in the United States, it's common fare that you can go to a restaurant and you can eat a steak or a hamburger. Those are two common things that are sold. They're both coming from a cow. And yet you try to serve rabbit, like a local restaurant did here on Main Street, in a restaurant called The Cure, and there's an outrage because there's a difference in our culture between a rabbit and a cow. And yet in a place like India, cows are sacred, so they will not touch cows, they'll let cows cross the road. And then in countries like Korea and Vietnam, they eat dogs. So there's a lot of what might be considered to be arbitrariness that goes on when eating animals, and it shows how interpretation, the attachment of meaning to the stimuli, is very culturally based. Now let's move on to other concepts that are discussed in this chapter. The next one is two concepts discussed together. It's the idea of high context culture versus low context culture. The main researcher that promoted this was Ed T. Hall, and he talked about how in a low context culture there is little meaning is in the context, and therefore the explicit meaning is in the message itself. So little meaning is coming from the surroundings. And a lot of times these cultures are new, like the United States is a low context culture, and that means explicit meanings need to be communicated directly. So for example, if you go to a park in the United States, you'll see signs that say no skateboarding, no skating, no smoking, no swimming, the park is not open after the hours of dusk, etc. There's a lot of very explicit direct messages. as opposed to somebody who goes to a park and looks around and would be able to determine just by the way that the park is set up that there's no place for skateboarding, that there are no cigarette ashtrays, that there is no beach for swimming, no swimming facilities, and so they understand that they should not go swimming. That would be a high context culture. High context culture is where it's sort of implied what your behavior is supposed to be. You don't need to have a direct message. I can remember going to China, and I can remember kind of doing a faux pas because I didn't recognize that everybody in the room, as soon as they entered the room in a large group setting, did not go up to the elder male in the room. This was an academic setting, so the elder male happened to be the equivalent of a dean at our university, and everybody is supposed to go up and pay their respects to that person before they say hello to anybody else in the room. It's implied. The culture's context communicates that that's what you're supposed to do. And since I'm an American, I would have expected that somebody come up to me and say, oh, you need to go say hello to Mr. So-and-so. It's a patriarchal society, so it's always a male, before you go and introduce yourself to someone else. Now, within that concept of high context versus low context, there is also the concept of face, or face saving, promoted by the researcher Ray Cohen. You know when you save face, right? It's where you don't want to lose your dignity in front of other people. So examples of losing your face are when you're being roughed, like being rebuffed, excuse me. Like when you ask somebody out on a date and they say no, and then it's like, oh, I'm embarrassed. Or when you're divided into two groups of people and you're picked for dodgeball teams in elementary school and you're the last person, you're rejected. Okay, that's the idea of saving face. In high context cultures like the China culture, direct confrontation is avoided. Otherwise, you lose face. If you directly confront somebody, it's seen as an insult to them. In Mexico, also a high context culture, if you go to Mexico and you're upset with your customer service in a bank, or if you're upset with something that somebody sold you, and you start raising your voice with them, the average Mexican person is going to shut down. It's embarrassing to them. Whereas in the United States, that's taken for granted. If you're upset, you get on the phone with customer service, you assert your rights. Listen, Verizon representative, I was charged for a data overusage, and it's not right. I had the control set on my phone. That's very, very normal in American culture. The idea of saving face is not as necessary as is in high context culture. Now we're going to go on to the concept of intercultural communication competence. This is ultimately what I want you to get out of this class, because what intercultural communication competence is all about is your ability to interact both appropriately and effectively in other cultures. And even though we're not traveling anywhere, we want you to be able to have these skills so that when you interact with others, it's not awkward for you. It's not the last time you're going to go abroad. It's not an experience where you have got yourself into a situation where you feel really uncomfortable and make decisions that you regret. And so intercultural competence is all about being able to interact in other cultures, and it's based on 4 different dimensions that we need to consider. And the first dimension is your personality strength. Personality strength. How strong does your personality come across when you interact in other cultures? Some cultures don't accept that as readily as others. Personality strength is related to your self-concept, what you think of yourself. It's related to self-disclosure, what you choose to reveal about yourself to others. It's related to self-monitoring, that is your ability to be aware of yourself when you're starting to say things that are maybe not accepted in another culture, and then control that. That's self-monitoring. And it's related to social relaxation. Social relaxation is the ability to feel at ease around others. So you have to be able to assess the degree to which your personality should be strong in another culture. When I go to Mexico, which is twice a year, I take public transportation all the time down there. Public transportation is fantastic where I go in Mazatlan, Mexico. And I often notice that when the snowbirds, or the gringos, as they are more commonly called, Americans and Canadians, get on the buses down there, they'll just say, "Where's Walmart? Where's Walmart?" And the tone of voice will be very strong and assertive. That's very normal in our culture. We taught that's appropriate to speak that way. But in Mexico, even though there won't be a negative outward reaction, the bus driver won't necessarily feel that that's something that they are happy about being addressed that way. They would rather a person come on the bus and say, "Hola, buenos dias, ¿dónde está el Walmart?" You know, to try and speak the Spanish language and to have a little bit more delicacy to the voice. So that's about personality strength. Next up is the communication skills. Communication skills are those message skills that we have, the ability to put things into words and to interact with others in ways that that culture is interacting. If you go to Canada, one of the things that Americans love to laugh about is that most Canadians end their sentences, unless they're French Canadians, with "eh." They'll make a comment like, "That was a great hockey game, eh?" And so as an American, you find yourself starting to adopt this "eh." It's not only the "eh," but it's the going up at the end of the sentence. We often end our sentences with a downward melody. It's going up. And once you start doing that, you are engaging in communication skills. You're engaging in a way like other people are being able to speak. All right, then next up is for intercultural communication competence is the concept of psychological adjustment. And that's the ability to acclimate to new environments. If you go to places in Turkey and in France still, rural places, and you need to use a bathroom and it needs to be number 2, a lot of times what you have to use are what is known as the footprints. The footprints, yeah, there's basically a hole in the ground. You have your privacy and 2 footprints. And that is very different to going to the bathroom in Amsterdam, in the middle of Amsterdam, where if you're a male, you can go to the bathroom in the middle of the street. All there is a half cylinder, just the size to cover your pelvic area, where you go stand behind. So nobody's actually seeing you, your private parts, but everybody knows what you're doing. But it saves you having to seek out a private business or a bathroom that may be across the way and put coins in it. And so that's an uncomfortable thing for a lot of Americans to have to adapt to. Just like when people come to the United States, it's very uncomfortable for them to have to accept the fact that if you want to go most places, you need an automobile, when people are used to taking public transportation or even walking because the distances are much shorter. So psychological adjustment refers to how well are you able to adjust. I've done a lot of research on homesickness in other countries, and I found that media can play a big role when you get in touch with your family on the internet or social media, or you're watching a baseball game or a football game. It helps to alleviate that psychological adjustment problem that some people have when they go abroad. And Americans often, when they travel, they try to reduce that by taking tours, by taking cruises, by going to hotels in Cancun, which are very much surrounded by very American-looking things, as opposed to just delving into what the culture does and trying to live the way that the culture does. That's when you're really expressing psychological adjustment. And then the final concept that goes along with intercultural communication competence is cultural awareness. And that is to understand the social customs. Drinking is one of the ways that people blend in society. If you're an alcohol drinker, that's one of the first things that people do, is they feel more relaxed, they let their guard down. But Americans drink very differently, and especially college students. And that's why I'm going to have a talk when I take my students to Sweden about getting smashed, about blacking out. Not that all American students do that, but you know as well as I do that plenty of ESU students and other students across the nation, that's the way they drink. When they drink to play beer pong, they drink to get smashed. Versus a French person, they're going to sip that beer all day long. So that's just one tiny example of being aware of how behaviors in other cultures might fit according to different customs. And back to Mexico again, when you pass a Mexican on the street, you better smile and you better wave, because that's expressing, according to Mexican culture, good health to the other person. So if you don't smile, you don't wave, you're not wishing them good health, and that's an insult. In America, of course, especially in the Northeast, when you pass a person, you're wary of them. You know, you'll walk right past a person on campus and not even know they're there because your face might be buried in your phone. But even if you do look at them, you're going to, and then look away, right? Or maybe one of those sort of forced smiles. All right, now let's move to the next concept, which is multiple identities and intercultural communication competence. Multiple identities. It's the idea that you take on different identities when you interact with people from other cultures. And there are 3 dimensions to this. You're kind of role-playing is one way to look at it. One dimension is the concept of the third culture. That's promoted by the researcher Useem, U-S-E-E-M, and his colleagues. And this is the idea that one way that you can get along with somebody else from another culture is you can both sort of create your own third culture. That's what Spanglish is all about. It's when two people, one's a Spanish speaker and the other one's an English speaker, they start speaking. One person will be saying amigo, and the other person will be saying man, and the other person will be saying gracias, and the other person will be saying right on. I mean, that's kind of an old saying, but it's combining the two languages to come up with a third language. Similarly, I was very struck upon remembering that one of the times that I was backpacking around Europe, I rented out a bicycle in Holland, very flat country to ride a bike in, and I was going to return my bicycle because the chain came off, and ahead of me was an Italian, and he had a flat tire, and he was trying to explain to the Dutchman what was wrong with his bicycle, and his English wasn't very good, but the Dutch spoke English, but he didn't speak Spanish, so didn't speak Italian, so the Italian said, my bike is, and you could see him searching for words, it's not well, he's describing it like it's being unhealthy. So when it got to my bike, I did describe my bike. Oh, my bike has a fever. So we had a good laugh, the Italian and I. We suddenly entered this world of describing our bicycle by talking about it like it was a patient. That's the idea of third culture. Then a second dimension of multiple identities is multiculturalism. Multiculturalism has a very strong theoretical basis in our country. There's a lot of research that goes on. It's very much a component of the curriculum here at ESU. And it's the idea that you respect cultures and you have a tolerance for differences. And so some people can say, you know, prostitution is wrong. Some people can say drug use is wrong. But when you look at a city like Amsterdam, that city is, in my opinion, the greatest experiment in human tolerance and therefore multiculturalism in the world. Because prostitution is legal, not that it's right, but it's legal. It recognizes that certain people have needs that cannot be fulfilled for whatever reason. Drug use, to some extent, soft drugs are legal. Hashish and marijuana you can purchase in coffee shops. And even people who are addicted to heroin, they have needle programs. They say, listen, we don't want you in the middle of the city interacting with others. Go off on a barge, on a canal, and we're going to supply you with needles as long as you stay there until you fix your problem. Homosexuality and transgendered sexuality are very open in Amsterdam. You would expect it's a city of chaos. It is not. It is a very neat and orderly city. And let me tell you, if you don't pay attention, you're going to get hit by a tram car or a bicycle. And if you get on the tram car and don't pay your ticket to get on, you're going to have an officer that gets on soon, is checking everybody's ticket. It's a very neat and orderly society, but it also happens to be a society that I think expresses multiculturalism, in part because it's a port city. And lots of ships have come through there in the history of Amsterdam en route to somewhere else. And if that city was not tolerant of all these people from Asia, from the Middle East, from the Western Hemisphere, from the South, from the North coming through, the city would not be able to thrive. Now the final multiple identity is post-ethnic cultures. Post-ethnic culture is where you leave behind your ethnic heritage and you become the culture that you, not necessarily of the country that you're in, but of the people and the environment that you're surrounded by. We have a student in this class, if you watched her introduction video, she described her ethnic heritage as being Honduran, but she thinks of herself mostly as an American. As hard as her mother tries to try and instill those Honduran rituals and values and beliefs, she is first and foremost an American. And that's what happens when you become acclimated to a culture. You take on a new persona that's post-ethnic, it's post or after the ethnicity that you used to have. Now I'd like to finish up with our final concept. It's intercultural communication ethics. Intercultural communication ethics is asking the question of what is right in terms of your communication behavior in other cultures. And as I mentioned at the outset of this, Western ethics tend to focus on individual freedoms. So for example, if you're driving a car in the middle of July in the United States and you pull up to the Wawa, like there is one right across the street from ESU, many students go there, it's hot as hell outside, and you say to yourself, I'm going inside a Wawa, I'm going to leave my air conditioning running while I go in and I get a Coke or a coffee or water or whatever I'm going to get, and then I'll come out and get my nice cool car. That's your right in our country. You paid for the gasoline. You're an individual. You get to have what you want. In Sweden, that is not acceptable. You are not allowed to let your car run for more than 1 minute because of the damage that it does to the environment. And if you do, you won't be pulled over by the police. It's more like the person who pulls up in the car next to you will roll down their window and they'll wag their finger at you. You must turn off your vehicle. Okay, so that's an example, even though Sweden is a Western country. It's an example of individualism triumphs other kinds of behaviors. Whereas in other countries, it's more along the lines of what is best for everybody. What is best for everybody? If we're going to change a tire on a car in Ghana, let's get everybody involved. Let's get everybody in the neighborhood to come out and help, because this car is really about all of us. It's not about my own personal vehicle. So the chapter finishes with some suggestions for what you should do if you want to be an ethical communicator in the context of an intercultural interaction. So one suggestion is that you always treat others with the same respect that you would want. So think about how you're acting if you're frustrated. Is the way that you're acting the way that you want somebody to treat you? Secondly, recognize that truth is socially constructed. The idea of what is the real or the actual or the truthful meaning in life is socially constructed. Just like I gave the example last class about assuming that lady that I heard in China was a propaganda person trying to get people to believe in the Communist Party. It was just an exercise lady. So truth is socially constructed by the country. What's real and what's imaginary is constructed within the environment you grow up in. Thirdly, to encourage people of other cultures to express their uniqueness, not tamp them down. Don't tell them, speak English. I mean, you may want them to because that's all you can understand, but don't turn off your Spanish completely. Don't turn off your African-American clothing completely. Don't turn off your hairstyle that's worn, that you've been wearing because it's part of your ethnic heritage completely. Let it out. Let's see it. Let's hear your funny expressions in Spanish. Let's see your crazy hairstyle. Celebrate others' uniqueness. And finally, strive for identification with people of other cultures. Strive to find out what you have in common with them rather than what the differences are. You speak to an English person who's pouring this big beer and putting it... Well, you know, that's kind of what Americans do. They do it differently. They have little cups and they throw a ping pong ball, and that's how they drink that kind of volume. But it's the same idea that is an appropriate amount of beer. There's something you're finding in common. So there you have it. That's going to wrap up our chapter that's on intercultural communication as it relates to perception and communication competence. Have a great day.